Nobody has actually proven the case, and indeed in Canada, with their own constitution, there are worse potential ways of undermining protection of evidence in court. The American approach, also the constitutional backdrop, is that they have something called a SEPA hearing, which is all the evidence that's available is put in front of a judge with secured advocates on both sides, and they agree before the trial starts what is appropriate to put in play in the trial. And as a result of that, if the SEPA hearing comes out as it normally does, in the interest of prosecutions, when the prosecution gets its way, we were told in America that the trial normally goes straight to plea. There's an instant guilty plea, and they then decide how they're going to handle over the sentence. Yeah, in other words, it saves year-long trials, this process. But there's no reason at all why that process in advance of the trial, a closed process, a bit like the secret courts I complained about, but a closed process to prove what evidence is allowed and not allowed, should not precede any case in this country.
I saw a hand here. Here we'll go to the Yes, you.
Actually, we're going to have to go vote.
Of course.
We've got 5 minutes.
Well, let's go to the question that Jerry asked.
Okay, Francis will remember the bar. Another point for your arsenal with Dominic and Maggie, and perhaps where I came in late, is that we allow interception of confessions in cell room confessions in prison, which is a far more unreliable and dangerous method of evidence than intercept evidence.
Well, I think it's an excellent point, and self-evidently correct. I think of my practice at the junior bar, where people were confessing to minor crimes all the time. The word of the police, and then you might get into the situation where classic verbally, where he said, she said, did he confess or not? The sort of thing that Police and Criminal Evidence Act was supposed to fix. But yet, as you absolutely say, that's right. Was there anything you wanted to say about that?
I think it goes back to the underlying point. This isn't about technology, it's about communication between different parties and what's permissible under the legal system. At the moment we seem to be in the worst of all worlds, where a lot of potentially useful evidence is not being used in court. And I think we really need to identify the sort of policies and processes we want in place as a country, independent of the technology. I don't think technology is sort of red herring that gets used. But actually, I can't think of any particular issues with technology that wouldn't fell true. I mean, you go back to the famous case of Mary Queen of Scots and the interception of encrypted letters back in 1586. And today there's talk about the complexity of separating out internet content from who's actually communicating with each other. But again, go back to the carrier pigeon example. You use different pigeons to send the same message between people, and they would be interpreted differently depending upon which carrier pigeon turned up. So there's always been that complexity of understanding both the context and the actual content we're looking at. So we shouldn't think this is anything new that requires a specific technology to fix.
That seems to me that's quite interesting for another reason, which is that GCHQ tell us they shouldn't have to expose this kind of intercept evidence because it would expose them to vulnerabilities and so forth. But also there's an unwillingness, at the point we've all discussed already, about cost and the difficulty of doing it. So rather than show what has been specific, individualised surveillance, they wanted to carry out surveillance of all of us, all the time, in the Intercept Modernisation Programme, and accumulate all of that material and put it together. It seems to me all of their practical arguments fall down when you consider that. Now there's a hand behind. Yes, Stephen.
It was clear since counter-terrorism laws have become more authoritarian that the public have lost complete faith in the police. That was also mentioned by David Davis. I'm just wondering, given that, what steps do you think can be taken so that police can restore that trust with the British people? Because until you have that trust, we can restore the liberties, we can take back 42 days, we can reduce it. But ultimately, if the public don't trust the police, then the police will take ever more authoritarian measures to try and spy on them.
I'm going to give you one answer, and when David and Dominic come back, we'll invite them to give another. My answer is very specific. We should stop altogether the power to stop and search people without suspicion. That is to say, by definition, You did not have a suspicion for stopping this individual, you stopped him at random. That power is currently being reviewed for pedestrians by the government. Why? It is self-evidently wrong. They said it was wrong in opposition. Why review it? Scrap it. You see, that power was used hundreds of thousands of times last year and the year before. Number of terrorists caught, 0. It became an instrument for bullying individuals on the street, a weapon for officers to interfere with the daily lives of others, rather than anything to do with the terrorist legislation under which it was passed. So that's my answer. We'll ask people when they get back. We'll also have to decide whether or not it would be rude to ask them what they were actually voting on. Let's see if they do. As they're so kindly speaking to them, we won't. I see a hand.
Following on from Joey's point about different media where interception takes place, it's also the case, and I'm interested, Alex, since your two speakers have left, at least whether Big Brother Watch is working on this, at least with bugging of officers' homes, cars. The law enforcement agencies have to, in some circumstances, get permission from the surveillance commissioners, who are at least retired judges, if not current judges, whereas intercepts are authorised usually by the Home Secretary. And I wondered if whether you've looked at or are campaigning for that to move to courts, that judges should be giving permission for that, as they do in the States and many other countries.
I'll answer and then we'll go then to Joe. We have looked at this at Big Brother Watch, and we've noted a worrying movement, indeed, in the States. Dominic Lazansky, sitting by you there, wrote a very good post for us about how warrantless bugging is starting to happen in the US. So rather than us moving to their system of structured, proper judicial approach, they're moving to ours and starting to give more power to people who want to conduct surveillance. But I also note this: the Office of the Surveillance Commissioner, which supposedly protects us in this area of otherwise frightening and opaque public life. The Office of the Surveillance Commissioner, which operated for 4 years with an expensive budget and big office and so forth, issued its annual reports recently, you may have seen. And that report showed that after 4 years of their endeavour, the number of unlawful surveillance operations has gone up. That is to say, this organisation that's supposed to protect us and look after all of this is patently failing. It was discussed on Radio 4, I was fortunate enough to be invited, and there was an empty chair opposite me, because the Office of the Surveillance Commissioner refused to comment on their own report. That's the organisation that's supposed to bring transparency to this area of public life. Jerry?
I think I'm right in saying there's two parts to the regime at the moment. There's the Secretary of State authorising the content interception, and an appropriate senior officer authorising interception of communications. And I think a couple of things there. One is, I think the notion of content communications being separate is not true. It's almost impossible to distinguish between the two. You start tracking communications, you're going to capture a lot of content. So the regime needs looking at anyway. And I think the idea of politicians, even in grand office of state, signing these things off needs review as well. I think you go back to the point about trust, and it's not just the police. I think the whole system needs to rebuild trust, and having the judiciary look at the evidence and authorise warrants, I think would be part of establishing that trust and a depoliticisation of the current regime that we have in place.
Well, I agree with that, but I would also say that at least having politicians involved gives some element of democratic accountability in the people. Someone you voted for at some point has a say in this, and that, I think, is and should be regarded as a good thing, not a bad thing. I tend to agree with David Willits on this. I think that there ought to be more democratic accountability rather than farming things out to bureaucrats. You can probably guess what we're talking about, but one of the questions we were asked that I really wanted to ask you about was, what would you do to try and restore trust in our police force?
Well, I mean, the first step is the current Tory policy of having commissioners, because it will actually make the argument about what the police force do a more public one. And that's a good thing. I agree with you that until you air these things, until you put them in public domain. Now, people say, oh, you're politicised the police, well, anything of the sort. And any of you been to a sort of police village hall meeting, it's very heated and it's very sort of people get cross about that, being stopped for going 33 miles an hour or having problems getting their shotgun license renewed or whatever, and very occasionally burglary comes up. But you know, it's hardly the most political of things. What it is a good area of these things. So a great deal more information. Things like crime maps are like a mundane thing, like crime maps, more information about exactly what happens to you. You know, people always say, you know, that the key point about politics is when it's local. And by local, they don't mean local as in your borough, they mean local as in your street. And if you start feeling you've got a link with people in your street, you know what's happening, what the performance is, what the priorities are, where the assets are being put, then I think that will help. That will help. Partly because it will mean people won't have illusions about it, but also partly because it will change the behaviour of the police. The simple truth is, you know, if the police are given guidelines, like anybody else, if you give a bureaucracy a set of guidelines, it will adhere very closely to those guidelines. And if those guidelines are fill-in forms for 80% of your time, then that's what they'll do. You know, it's provide information for the minister, that's what they'll do. And if it's actually get out and be seen on the streets, then that's what they'll do.